So what is trauma? Today on Life Talks, we're going to be talking about something that really has just become a part of the regular cultural conversation. Yes. I'm Ben. I'm here with Josh. He's our executive producer. And welcome to Life Talks, where we talk about the issues of life, how it pertains to the Word of God, living out the Christian faith. Josh, when you hear trauma, what do you think of?
Oh boy. I mean, I think of right now, I think of a lot of TikTok videos from counselors talking about trauma that I watch that are all helping me and giving me new ideas of ways to think about all kinds of things. I probably think of really terrible things happening to people. I think of, just some of the violence and terrible abuse and things like that.
I mean, I'm trying to remember growing up, trauma. I know trauma was a thing, but it has become almost a mainstream thing. Don't you? Haven't you recognized that?
I feel like there's a lot of words that are sort of like pop psychology that are used more often now. I don't know that they're always used accurately, right? Because they are part of pop psychology. So words can kind of become looser or broader.
I've noticed something. So like young people love to recreate language. And you know what I mean? Like they love to say things. And I've heard two terms over the past, I would say 6 to 8 months that have really, as someone who's training, getting my master's in counseling psychology, it's like, that's interesting. Have you heard the term trauma dumping before?
Is that someone who dumps all of their trauma stuff on you?
Yes. Yeah. So someone who basically pours out these are all the horrible things that have happened to me, right?
Yes.
So I've heard that term used before. Oh, someone just trauma dumped me. You know what I mean? And then I heard trauma bonding.
Yes.
Have you heard that term before?
Yes, when you bond with each other over your shared trauma experiences.
I remember my daughter talked to me like, oh, me and my friends, we were trauma bonding over this one issue. And I'm just like, and I found that fascinating because the whole idea of trauma, I mean, trauma bonding is a thing. Don't get me wrong. Like people that go through traumatic events can bond.
Right.
But they were using trauma bond as we went through something uncomfortable and now we're trauma bonding.
Yeah. The word became way more broad.
It's very
from how
broad.
Professional psychologists might use it.
So one of the reasons I bring this up is, number one, I feel like because of that over usage of the word, it almost feels like if everything's trauma, then nothing is trauma.
Yeah.
And so that I feel like if you're going to talk about trauma, in an educated way, in a knowledgeable way, we're going to talk about that today. The other reason I want to bring this up, Josh, is I really find, again, that most Christians do not delve into the world of psychological terms very well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Why? That's interesting.
Well, I mean, this is a complete sidebar, but when I was in Bible college, I had to read a book called Why Christians Can't Trust Psychology.
Oh, I'm very fascinated. Tell me about it.
So the whole idea is psychology is built upon the premise of understanding man without God. And in some ways, they're right.
Sure.
But here's the thing. There's a difference between the philosophy of psychology and the science of psychology. And those are two very different things.
Yeah.
Okay? Psychology is essentially a field of study of understanding the human psyche, the human brain, the human mind, all those kinds of things. And the reality is, the Bible is, again, our authority of understanding about not just humanity, but all things, like the God and salvation. But we also know this, that the Bible is never meant to answer every question about humanity.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It's not a science book.
It's not. For example, you'll never read anything about open heart surgery. In the Bible. There are a lot of things the Bible does not address. Now, I would say this: the Bible is applicable for all things. So okay, even though the Bible doesn't talk about open heart surgery, the Bible does talk about how to care for your body. The Bible talks about how to do things that are wise. I mean, things that pertain to making decision on open heart surgery.
Yeah.
So it's applicable to all things, but it does not speak to everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand.
Yeah.
So what do we do with this realm of trauma that is now everywhere?
Yeah.
And how do we build the bridge, or where does the Bible talk about trauma? Is so that as a follower of Jesus, I'm never going to diminish the authority of God's word, but I want to be able to understand it in light of what people are learning about trauma.
Yeah.
Okay. Because even this idea, I was reading an article, listening to some podcasts about trauma, and one of the podcasts I was listening to pointed out that the whole idea of trauma-informed care really took off in 2018 when Oprah was interviewing, and I wish I would have written down the name of the guy. Some guy wrote a book about trauma-informed care. I think it's called What Has Happened to You or something like that. But the whole idea is trauma is not who you are, it's what's happened to you. So understand that. But this thing, just takes off culturally, and all of a sudden, the idea of trauma-informed is it becomes part of the vernacular. Even me going back to school, getting my master's, you have to be certified in trauma-informed care. Like if I was to advertise myself as a therapist in the future, which I don't plan on necessarily going into that field personally.
Right.
But in order for me, like that is a certification I can get to tell someone, if you've been through trauma, I know how to handle your traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
I've been qualified by this third-party institution that studied trauma to help you know how to and because trauma is a real thing. Right? Like you would agree that trauma is a real thing.
Absolutely. I don't know exactly what the boundaries ought to be, like how we use it or whatever, but yeah, it's absolutely a really, really important thing. And that makes me wonder, like the author who was on Oprah, who was talking about trauma-informed therapy, was he using the word trauma roughly the way that professionals do, or was he already broadening it?
No, he was talking about it in a professional level.
Cool.
And let me just back up. So yes, this has been a long introduction, basically saying trauma is a word that's probably used and overused in most of our situations. Okay, if you get your coffee from Starbucks and it's a little lukewarm, that's not trauma. Even though you're really looking forward to your coffee that morning.
Even if the barista scowled at you while giving it to you. It was
they called it, my daughter's name is Hallie and she's always been called Haley. So if they mispronounced your name, that's not trauma.
Yeah.
Okay? But I think there's this feeling that there's this fragility that I think a lot of people want to say there's something traumatic that happened to me that maybe isn't really trauma. So, okay, let's take a step back. Where does this word trauma come from? Do you know where the word trauma comes from?
No idea.
Again, one of my favorite things to do, Josh, is
tell me the etymology.
The etymology of words is one of my favorite things to study. Trauma is actually a Greek word.
No kidding.
It's an ancient Greek word that simply means wound.
Huh. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
So in the you really see the word trauma used really, there's this one of these trackers that tracks how much words are used.
Yeah.
And you start seeing the word trauma used in the late 19th century, early 20th century, dealing with people that are physically wounded.
Right. Like I was going to guess, like I could imagine a spike when the show ER came on and everyone's like traumatic head wound or whatever. Like I imagine
we have trauma centers at hospitals, right? The whole idea is your body has been wounded and you need care.
Yeah.
And it really had, so that's the traditional history of the word.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, as psychology has continued to develop, there's been some I would say double usage of words over time. The first time that we see post-traumatic stress disorder used, it's in the DSM-3 in 1980. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
And I know I'm asking, do you know that? Because you're studying these things. But okay, so
that's interesting.
So trauma becomes more of a psychological issue as people are studying veterans coming out of wars. Okay, so for example, in the Civil War, I didn't know this, but in the Civil War, there were soldiers that had some kind of mental effects from fighting in battle. They called it soldier's heart.
Huh.
Okay.
Soldier's
heart. So do you remember what did they call it after World War I? Do you have any clue?
No.
Shell shocked.
Oh.
The term shell-shocked was what they described for people coming out of the battlefield who were psychologically, they had experienced something. They're different.
Yeah.
Right? They're a different person.
Yes.
From before they went off to war to after they went off to war.
This came from like artillery
shells, but just the whole experience of the death, all the pain, sure, the sorrow of all that.
But the word shell shocked, that I'm assuming that was connected to something like that. Okay.
And then World War II, they called it battle fatigue.
Battle fatigue?
Battle fatigue.
That's a real demotion, I think, right? That's like if you're experiencing something really, really horrible, and it's like, you're fatigued.
It's the first time that they started to recognize and they would actually pull soldiers off the front line and they put them in actual hospitals when they realized there's something not right with this guy. Like he needs to get away from the front lines because it's messing with his brain.
Okay, and they just needed a stronger term then.
So battle fatigue was what they called it.
Yeah,
and so there was this growing awareness of it, and as the Veterans Administration was finding that there's a psychological disorder here, we need to figure out what this is. When the Vietnam War was happening. Again, this is when the field of psychology was really starting to mature, and they started tracking things. And it wasn't until after the Vietnam War, as they're studying veterans coming home, that they came up with this diagnosis or this terminology, post-traumatic stress disorder. So the whole idea is you've experienced trauma. In a way that, and typically how they would define trauma, historically was a near-death experience. Something that you almost died or you were around death and therefore it's left its effect on you.
Yeah.
And we all see this today. Like we know that it's not just battlefields. It can be my family, a fire, surviving a fire, natural disasters.
Here's a really random example of that. One of the survivors of the Titanic ended up living outside of, it was either, I think, Chicago, the big baseball stadium in Chicago, and would get triggered because the sound of the roaring crowds, he said, is exactly what it sounded like when all the people ended up in the water right after the ship sank. Wow. And like no one had heard that kind of thing before, but then he ends up there. So like that's the idea. Like he was traumatized, heard this thing, and then now he's hearing this similar thing. Puts his brain kind of together.
And so people that have gone through war know that there are certain things that will trigger them. Okay. That will bring them back to those feelings, those emotions. So what trauma does, and I know I'm hitting a lot of different things here, but trauma does, what we do know is it does effectively rewire the brain in a way. Like you would look at brain scans of people pre and post a traumatic event, and there's differences. For example,
what does that mean? like help us. And like, I've heard that before, but like, tell me what that means.
So what that means is someone who has PTSD, their amygdala, and again, the amygdala is kind of like that little pea-sized part of your core inner brain that sends signals to the rest of your brain and your body, danger, danger, danger. So like if you and I were to walk outside of the office here and a copperhead slithers across our path, you and I are going to do a couple different things, right? I'm going to jump into your arms like Scooby-Doo and Shaggy, right?
As if I will still be there.
We will either run, we will freeze, or we will grab something and throw it at it. I mean, that's just the fight, flight, or freeze kind of responses to something fearful. So the amygdala instantly triggers a warning, something's not right here. So what trauma does is trauma is a very real experience where death, danger happens, and all of a sudden there's other things that will remind. So all of a sudden, instead of you start seeing copperhead snakes everywhere. You hear a loud bang.
You're hypersensitive.
So the amygdala now is overactive in your brain to send messages to your body. Protect yourself,
like a hamster on a wheel spinning really hard.
You're not safe. You need to duck for cover. There's these things that are. That's what trauma does. Trauma can have this impact on you. So first of all, your amygdala is overactive. You're also less your PFC, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain which is logic, reason, arguments are figured out here. That part of your brain has less activity because here's what trauma. If I could use this illustration, everything that happens to you and I, we have a filing cabinet in our brains. So every experience we have a little like, okay, this experience of, I put this experience with my wife or my mom or my coworkers, I put in these file cabinets. Yeah. People can be mean to you. People can be rude to you. There's all kinds of things that people can happen to you, and you're kind of like, okay, I know what to do. I've lived around enough to know where this memory or this experience, and I file it away into a filing cabinet. Yeah. What trauma does is you get an experience and you don't know you have no file for this. Yeah. Like, I don't know where to put this. And so all of a sudden, it's like you have imagine this nice, neat room where everything are these, so every experience you're just kind of filing these things away. This is what your brain's doing. Yeah. But then there's this pile of cards on the ground that you don't know what to do with. Yeah. But anytime something in that pile, you get triggered by that pile, you're like, oh, what do I do here? And there's just this, like, you're uncertain, and it brings you to this place of uncertainty. You feel like you don't know how to cope with these emotions or feelings or whatever it is. So what trauma does is you're not able to have a file. There's no filing cabinet for what you've just been through. That's what trauma does to your brain. Okay. So more activity in the amygdala, less activity in the prefrontal cortex. The other thing is your body has a decrease in serotonin. It doesn't produce serotonin as much.
What does that do?
Serotonin is that chemical that it kicks through your brain to be like, oh, it's going to be okay.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So when let's just say you get a tax, you get a call from the IRS and you're like, hey, there's been a mistake on your taxes. You're going to owe $15,000. Okay. Right. Instantly, you're going to be like, oh no, like, how am I going to pay for this? And you're going to start going crazy.
The amygdala's
going off. The next day they call you, hey, that was a mistake on our part. We mixed your file up with someone else's. You're going to be okay. Instantly, your brain is going to be kicking out serotonin like, oh, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Okay, got it.
So the serotonin is the chemical in your brain that says, it's going to be okay. Okay? We all want more serotonin in our bodies. Yes. And then there's an increase in dopamine levels in PTSD, people with PTSD.
What's that do?
Dopamine is the there's a direct, not a direct correlation. There's a lot of correlation between people who abuse chemical substances and people who have what they call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Okay, so ACEs has been this new kind of growing research trend within psychology to figure out, like, when children go through these adverse experiences, the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to be addicted to drugs and alcohol. The more addicted you are to live risky behavior. There's all kinds of homelessness, like everything that can go wrong in your life. It really depends on how kind of these. So ACEs could be a kind of trauma that kids can go through, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this experience. Now, what do I do? Yeah. Right. So dopamine is that idea that it takes more for me. Dopamine is just kind of like another level of serotonin it's a pleasure sensor. Okay. So if those are increased, it takes more for you to really enjoy things. Okay. So there's this effect of PTSD that we know chemically, biologically in your brain, trauma has had an effect on you. Yeah. Okay. So, man, we only got a couple minutes left. Let me just. Do you have any questions as I've talked?
I do have a question. So, and this might be a helpful clarification before we move to the next episode. So, I hear, and I think there's a lot of, a lot of common ground, a lot of agreement that people sometimes use the word trauma too loosely now. Words kind of change meaning over time. And so we want to kind of like be aware of that. But then on the other hand, there's also sort of a trend as time goes on, like there's stuff that like our grandfathers were like, that doesn't matter. that we're like, no, it's good that we're like talking about that now. And there's like this increased sensitivity or something like that as people try to figure out like, how should we think about different things? And sometimes the pendulum swings too far the other way.
So for example, how can two individuals, let's just take, I'm going to take two, I'm going to give you two examples. How can one guy be fighting alongside another guy in battle? One of them experiences PTSD, the other guy doesn't. Okay? That's interesting question.
That is interesting.
Okay, because not everyone who goes to war has PTSD.
Yes.
Another major form of PTSD can happen to especially women that experience sexual assault. Okay? And what we do know is that the number one cause for PTSD amongst all the general population is a near-death experience. Okay?
Totally makes sense.
The second most common reason for PTSD or some kind of traumatic stress disorder would be sexual assault, rape, those kinds of things. Okay? So there are some women, and again, I'm not minimizing the experience, but there are some women that will have PTSD from a sexual assault and some women that will not. Okay? So so is it about the event? Yes. But it's also about the person. Because just because someone goes through an event does not mean that they will have trauma.
You want Christians to kind of have this balanced thing where we are not going too far on one end of the spectrum or the other, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, it seems like there's a good thing is sometimes as Christians, like modern Christians are becoming more sensitive to like some things that didn't used to be taken seriously. Like spiritual abuse is probably not a phrase that was used a lot 100 years ago.
But existed,
right? Yeah. Even though it's not physically it's not the same as physical trauma, but it can be a different kind of a thing. And so how can we balance? On one hand, you've got teenagers saying trauma bonding all the time and sort of like they're kind of using the term differently and kind of this kind of sort of experience. And we want to be careful about that. But then on the other hand, we want to be appropriately sensitive and even learning to be more sensitive about whatever things that we ought to be more sensitive to.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes. That's the whole point I'm trying to do. You explained it very well. I don't want us to be ignorant about trauma.
Yeah.
I also don't want us to excuse it, and I don't want us to abuse it. And so I want us to understand it through what the science has shown it to be. I want us to understand it through the lens of God's word, how our faith can help us through trauma.
Yeah.
And I also want us to be educated so that when we are walking with people that are experiencing trauma, we do not in ourselves dismiss it with like the Bible verse kind of thing. Like, here's a Bible verse and your trauma is not that big a deal.
Yeah.
Like that, I think is a really bad thing that a lot of Christians have done over the years, kind of, almost minimizing traumatic experiences and then just thinking, well, just pray about it. And again, I'm not saying that prayer can't help. I'm not saying that God is not the healer of trauma. But what I don't want to do is provide this kind of this flippant, easy solution for something that can be very difficult for a lot of people. And that's what I want us to be very aware of. Yeah. And, you might be listening to, I didn't even get to my definition of trauma. So we'll get to my definition of trauma next episode. Well, this has just been a introduction of the idea of trauma.
The intro.
The introduction to the introduction. I hope as you're listening to this, as we kind of wrap up this part of the conversation, you might have had some traumatic experiences in your own life that you have gone through. And one of the things I'm hoping that if you're listening to this is to not ignore it and to not kind of like bury it, but that you will learn how to invite God to openly engage with it, to invite God into it and to invite a community into it, because there's too many people that suffer alone with trauma. And that God never wants those those emotional, physical, or spiritual wounds to define who we are. And so I'm hoping that this has been an opportunity. Maybe you heard something this episode that really was like, man, I want to learn more about that. And one of the things I'll try to do at my final episode with this entire series, give you guys some resources, books, podcasts that you can listen to help you kind of take the understanding of trauma to the next level. So this has been an introduction to the idea of trauma. Thanks again for joining us on Life Talks, and we'll talk to you next time.